organizations attempt adopting DevOps and Agile practices only to crash against a compliance wall. But it really shouldn't be that hard. In Agile compliance and risk operations, Mark Peters with Technical Corporation will share his experience incorporating an Agile workplace with U.S. government compliance.
Good morning. I'm Dr. Mark Peters with the Technical Corporation. I'm here with the briefing Agile Compliance and Risk Operations at GitLab Commit 2020. Excited to be part of the conference, excited to be part of the You Belong Here. So I'll offer you the standard government caveat going in. That these views represent me and not my corporation or the government as a speaker. They do represent the team and the team that I was working with over the past several months and some of the things we found as we were working with them. So with that, I'll jump right into it and talk some about DevOps and government contracting. So first, a little bit about me. I used to work in the Air Force. I retired after 22 years in the Air Force as an intelligence operator, which gave me oodles of experience with compliance practices. I've seen compliance at all levels. I've seen compliance at the personal level. I've seen compliance at the security level. I've seen compliance with flight operations. I've seen compliance with cyber operations. So I've had a lot of experience trying to make compliance work, dealing with the various checklists that the government wants along the way. With that, in looking at cybersecurity, I built and implemented at all those levels as well. I've worked at the tactical level, working with fighters. I've worked at the strategic level, working with national agencies. But in the past year or so, I've worked with two different government contractors, and they've both been trying to attempt an agile transition into a government program, in trying to bring that program out of that government waterfall mindset in more of a flexible mindset that we associate with Agile. With one, I worked as a project engineer, and now I work as a product owner. Now I work as the lead security engineer. So more of a grasp on how that security has to roll in overall and how we have to do our development work in compliance with everything else. I'm also a DevOps Institute ambassador, where I get a chance to talk to a lot of great people at the DevOps Institute and learn a lot of things, which is where I get a lot of these practices from. Just about me, I'm an avid reader. I read a little bit of everything, sci-fi, fantasy, and then all the work-related stuff along the way. I did write a book about cashing in on cyber, looking at cyber power, looking at 10 years of economic attacks. And I do have a doctorate in strategic security. Not in arithmetic, but it was good at the time. So with that, I'll jump right into our story about why we belong and how we fit our security into belonging in our overall team. The problem that we were facing as we sat down and we looked at this program we were coming into was, how does my security team, my small security team, 4 people on the security team, reference about 100 developers or so, and then probably about 40 or 50 out in the ops community. How do we ensure compliance? How do we enforce those standards? How do we remain agile along the way? So we face this problem daily because we wanted to be agile. We wanted to be more flexible. We didn't want to hang in a corner as the security team and just kind of be there and be the standard of offering no every time we talked. We wanted to make the developers work and create value for the overall product. So in looking at this problem, we started to categorize what it was that we needed to do to be both agile and compliant. And we saw that we had the NIST 853, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, that the government uses. So with that, they had about 19 categories of control families. And with those, they have about 1,000 different indicators. So instead of looking at those indicators as risk management, the government looks at those as you have to answer everyone. And in answering everyone, you'll manage the risk. Which is an ideal solution for an administratively heavy organization, but not so ideal for Agile. So we had to match that into Agile. We had to look at our 4 principles of taking people over processes, of delivering functional software, and we looked at our Scrum Guide to move us forward. And then we tried to categorize the problem, because looking at that is a problem that people have been trying to solve for a long time. So we tried to standardize it to what are our parameters. And we came up that we needed to standardize through those standards, through those NIST standards. We had to be able to manage risk. And then, of course, we had to look at whether we could just buy a solution, whether somebody had already solved this problem for us, and we could move forward from that point to the next step. So, to be compliant or agile as we move forward. Compliant and agile are normally seen as opposite ends of the same road. They pull on each other. You can be one but not the other. If you go to agile, the thought is you go so fast that you're not compliant. If you try to be compliant, the thought is there's so much standards there that you can't be agile. Compliance is normally seen as a legally prescribed method, something someone comes in from the outside who has no idea what you're doing and assigns this to you and tells you this is what you have to do. These things like FIPS, FSMA, SOX, in various other degrees, various standards, whether they're organizationally prescribed in terms of what your organization or your group of organization tells you to do, or they're government prescribed, where the government comes in and tells you, hey, you have to do this because it's a statute. We need to be careful because we want to protect people's privacy. We want to protect their situation. So we see a lack of freedom and blockers in most compliance standards. On the other hand, Agile, we see things like Lean and Scrum and DevOps, things that are moving faster, that are bringing people together, that are trying to work and trying to create value throughout the entire organization and deliver it to the customer as soon as possible. They're more of a loose framework, more of a guide and a culture than that standard step-by-step framework that you see in compliance. This can lead to high-level success, but sometimes sees as getting the job done at all costs. And sometimes people feel that being agile drops that compliance behind. So we have to deal with risk. In dealing with the government, we work at risk, we look at risk, and we try to look at where that risk is. We have to be able to talk to our customers about risk because ultimately what compliance wants is to reduce the risk of your organization. They want to look at something that's a threat. They want to take that down. They want to minimize the risk as much as possible and say that because we're compliant, we've reduced the risk, therefore we're safer, therefore we're creating value for the customer. So in order to reduce the risk, you have to know the elements. You have to look at the various elements. You have to look at where risk becomes threat times vulnerability times exposure. And that's the little math that we have, but I don't like using the numbers, so we don't use the numbers. We talk about those things, so we talk about those things in combination. We talk about how a new threat or a new vulnerability creates that threat, creates that risk, and then we talk about whether or not it's exposed. Obviously, if your firewall is behind multiple other solutions, behind a VPN, behind connections, behind two-factor authentication, behind other security rules, you don't have that exposure that you would for a web API, for being out there in a space that everyone could see it. So how do you manage those things? How do you make that its awareness and not try to reduce everything to the lowest element possible, but to work through the compliance through the various elements and get to the place where you need to be in order to move forward? So in our Agile compliance, in our attempt to deliver Agile compliance, what we wanted to do was we wanted to maintain that compliance. We want to make sure that we answer those NIST standards without sacrificing the flexibility and find a way that we could do that. And we also wanted to have a risk operation, right? We wanted to effectively manage multiple risks across the way because everybody has their own risks and everybody has a different set of risks. As security, we have to understand everyone's risk because everyone's problem becomes a necessary problem when they come to you and say, I've got this new vulnerability, it just popped last week, it came out on the CVE list, and you know you need to take care of it. And we need to be able to say, well, it's great we understand your vulnerability, but in being agile, we're going to deal with that in time. And right now, we think we've got you at limited exposure. So how do we look at these things? How do we break these things out in a manner that we can deal with them and we can deal with them effectively to manage our Agile compliance and risk? The first step, of course, is looking at who wants to sell us methods. Who's out there that can already offer us a method to do things? And we see Scaled Agile for Enterprise or the Scaled Agile frameworks. And we see that somebody already has a solution, or at least they have the steps to the solution. But you still have to implement those solutions, and you have to find a way to work through Agile. You look at Disciplined Agile, which is the program management professionals' view of Agile and how they make Agile work in a framework for them, how they make Agile work against those standard 5 characteristics of the program management, how they work it through the steps and the families. And then, of course, you have companies that want to come in and just sell you, bring you an expert, and show you the expert and say they'll come in, they'll fix all your problems, they'll give you all the solutions, and then they'll leave you with the problem to still fix on your own at the end of the day. We also see overlays. A number of companies overlays, and the overlays are great. They give you good things, and depending on the level of the journey that your company is at, depending on how much you belong to the overall process, those overlays might work for you because we see things like the ITIL overlay and the frameworks that they use and the CMMI and the site reliability engineering certifications that help you and help you answer the questions of those processes. Again, at various levels, because you can always get a company to come in and use that certification for you and associate your maturity overall. And then who wants to sell you just experts? Who wants to give you an expert for your organization? And in full disclosure, as I mentioned earlier, I am a contractor for a government organization, or for an organization that contracts to the government and supplied as an expert in one of those positions. So we'd kind of already gone that route. So we'd already kind of made this decision. But still, the next step is how do we get to that Agile compliance? How do we move ourselves forward? How do we find out what those fixes are for us? And Agile is about culture. So first, we had to adopt a philosophy because the government is very waterfall heavy and has been waterfall heavy for a long time. And they do have reasons to be waterfall heavy because for a lot of times this stuff is important. It matters to people's lives and it matters to the defense of the nation. And they wanted to be careful about everything they put out there. They didn't want to introduce vulnerabilities and they didn't want to introduce exposure. So they came back. But we looked at our philosophy for our security team and for our local team with the constraints of what we were trying to do for the government. And we look at it as a security user story. Who uses security? Who needs to use security? And in talking about that, we decided that our devs are our users because they need to have secure products. And if they don't have a secure product, it won't create value for the customer at the end of the day. And then all the work, however neat, however exciting, however creative they get, doesn't get that value out to the government. And we looked at our devs from their perspective. What was their user story? And they saw us as enablers. So we had to be enablers. That means being part of the process, get involved with them, understanding their terms, understanding their language, and talking to it overall. And we had to talk about the product owner story because compliance adds value. How do you get to the right compliance? And how do you make sure that you're compliant? I can go back to a story back a long time ago in my intelligence career where we talked about compliance. And I was working in an active operation and found out that one of the terms wasn't complying in a way that could potentially threaten our overall security and our overall national security. And so I turned it off. And sure enough, 10 or 15 minutes later, I had somebody's finger poking in my chest saying that I turned it off and I was risking everything and I was threatening the whole process and we needed to get to a better place. And I needed to find a way to re-enable it. And we did, and we worked through it, but we found a way that was compliant and that was compliant in a hurry to get to that place because that compliance adds value and makes sure that we're doing the right things. And with that, we need to manage multiple users through a risk operation. Everybody who comes in, every different dev has a different risk. And they want to manage the risk, or they may not want to manage the risk. They may want to produce their product. But we need to make sure that the product adds risk in a careful, measured way to the entire structure, that we understand how that fits into our Agile. And with that, we suggested solutions without really having leverage. Because as we mentioned on the security team, the devs are the users. So we really have to suggest a way that allows them to get to their end state, or the ops guys to their end state, without compromising what they're already doing, without reducing the functionality of their feature as we move forward. So while we're shooting for long-term success, we're looking for short-term compliance because we're trying to be agile. So we're trying to manage that compliance in small bits, in small pieces that help us move forward. And part of that understanding, part of being able to move forward in small bits, is being able to understand the tools. When we jump into the government, we try to understand what tools we have and what's there, and whether or not they're the right ones. Because we want to know if we can use those tools, so we can take those tools to challenge the old models, to use those tools to help generate transparency along the way, to help us get involved in the Scrum process, and as security, understand what the developers are doing without having to get in their faces all the time and tell them, no, you just can't do it. So we looked at the tools we have. We looked at testing new tools. We looked at DI2QE for Kubernetes. We looked at Trello for workflows as opposed to the DI2E. That's the defense intelligence that we use for workflows through Jira and Confluence. We looked at Clara for containers. We looked at SaltStack for automations. We looked at a lot of these things. And we look at these things all the time because as security, we want to know what the newest tool is out there. And not just from a security perspective, but how do we integrate these tools in a way that makes the process better? And we actually, because we're at GitLab Commit 2020, we belong here, we did start using GitLab. We instituted GitLab from Jenkins for CI/CD. We took that pipeline, we put it into place, we put SonarQube in place for code scanning, we put ACAS at the other end to do our security technical implementation guidance that the government likes, and our CVE scans on kind of a nightly basis to make sure that we're working those processes through. But in all fairness here, with that open transparency, when we started talking about moving from Jenkins to GitLab, I started looking at GitLab and I started looking at all those security tools that were out there. And I thought, this is great. Everybody's going to be transparent. It's going to be involved. And I went back to our devs and I said, it's great. We can turn on all these security features. And got the, hey, we didn't buy that package. So you have to talk all the way along the way. And we try to talk about the right things. And we try to talk about security. But that transparency is making everyone along the stream understand how things work. So when we launched in, part of our solution was that we were a new team, we were a new contract. We tried to figure out where we started and what occurred before. We tried to delve into the previous events and the previous stories so that we can find out exactly where we were on our risk matrix. And being part of the government means we needed access. We needed to be able to get into those things, and sometimes that takes time. And the government had to verify everyone and get everyone into their computer systems and get everyone to their networks and their property and try to help us along. But along that process, we saw that resistance to change, that initial reluctance to make the changes, to be more transparent, to open things up. When we look at it, we know that change creates error. If things change, if things are different than they were before, there's some error involved. There's some exposure, and there's some vulnerability, and there's some threat, and that creates the risk. But overall, indecision creates disaster. If you don't make the decisions and you just let it go, it's going to break eventually. So what we wanted to do with our Agile compliance mindset is we wanted to try to create small decisions in small increments. Along to the right, you can see one of the pipeline structures we have that we use now, where we put steps and we put testing in at every phase. And with that testing, we created transparency. And we created transparency and metrics that are good not just for the devs to develop their products, but that we could use as security, and we could take them back so that we could actively see the risk and we could quantify the risk, and we could talk to the devs about that small steps, where in the testing they were having problems, rather than coming in at the end and saying, well, it's not compliant, just stop. Right? It's not the right thing. So we had to communicate. We had to communicate all the time with these different folks to make sure that they were getting the message and they were being compliant with what we needed to do. But it wasn't just our team that needed to make solutions. We needed to make an organizational solution. We needed to come in across the process, and we needed to look at how we could fix our contractor process. So we had a complete DevOps solution for our Agile compliance and our risk operation, not just a little feature. We needed to work through our leadership structure, make sure that we were building good teams. And part of that building good teams was assigning one of our security team. We only had 4, right, including myself, but we had 4 teams of probably 20 developers, as well as ops teams, as well as other teams, making sure that everybody had a functional responsibility to be part of that team, to be in their meetings, to be in their daily stand-ups, to be in their structures, so that we could do the right things for them and that we could enable them to create value. And that meant investing in people too. We had to get the right people, and we had to be able to harvest the process back and forth. As we invested in the people, as we taught them, as we spent our time explaining what it was we were looking for, we could harvest those results in the process at the far end, as we got better security and better to be Agile compliant. For integration, we really had to beat the street, right? We had to go out and we had to advocate security all the time. And we had to advocate security in a way that built transparency, but also created value. Again, I talk to stories because part of belonging is telling your right stories and telling the stories in the right place. I had a senior mentor years and years ago, and one of the things he told me was, he said he was going out, and this was a flag level officer in the military. He said he was making these speeches, and he had an individual come up to him and he said, hey, every time you go out and you make a speech, you say the same things. You say the same 3 things, and I've got it. I heard it the first time. I'm really invested. I'm really excited. Why do you say the same 3 things? I want to hear something different. I want to hear something new. And he said, he turned to me and he said, look, he said, I figure that 10% of the people hear me 10% of what I say 10% of the time. So to get the message across, I figure I've got to say the same thing, or to get the message across to everyone, I've got to say it at least 30 times. And I've got to keep on those messages. So rather than switching my messages and switching what we're talking about, what I do is I focus. And that way, by saying it enough times, I can ensure that everyone hears me, everyone gets the message, and we can move forward. And that's what we're trying to do by talking about security all the time. By talking about how we intend to be Agile compliant, by talking about the risk, by talking about creating value, about moving forward. And we do that through linking the items and tasks, linking the items in our workflow. Again, we see a CI/CD pipeline. We see how that workflow includes security. It includes a static at the front and the ACAS scans at the end, so that we get both levels of security. And we're working on integrating more tools all across the step, so we get more visibility into how these tools work. And we build those through our backlog. When something fails a test, it doesn't just stop. It goes back into the backlog. We find a way to fix it. We find a way to move it forward. And we prioritize it in a way that creates value for the customers for the things they want to do. So our organizational takeaways, first off, practice, right? Malcolm Gladwell wrote a paper called Outliers back in the 90s. He talked about using deliberate practice to get better. He suggested that you had to do something 500 times for familiarity, 5,000 times for competence, and possibly up to 50,000 times to get mastery of that single task that you're looking for. So if we considered Scrum to be a task, to think you would do it 50,000 times is just an unrealistic expectation. So you really have to work on the deliberate practice. How do we get it better? How do we work it every day? And how do we focus on those things, those small things that are important to us in order to move forward and make our organization get better? And part of that practice is our never stop learning. We work through our backlog. We work through our prioritization. We learn about what is going on. We learn about the product. We learn about the customer. We learn about how we can manage our risk and what each risk is individually so that we understand that risk. And in talking, we can talk about the threat. We can talk about the vulnerability, we can talk about the exposure, and we can innovate through those processes to create a way that creates the right key performance indicators for us so that we can measure each risk separately and individually to produce a collective answer that generates value as a multiple rather than as an individual. And then, as I mentioned, we got to advocate. You got to beat the street. You got to say it all the time. And in saying it, we have to be doing it ourselves so that we convince others. We have to be talking about where our risk exists and the risk that we're managing for us as we attempt to get compliance, because there's always a risk in that as well. If we don't meet our compliance standard, then we can get shut down by other pieces of the government. And that loses the program for everybody, not just for the compliance folks. But it mainly starts with the compliance folks of having the right process in place. And we try to build relationships over processes. We want to be involved, and that's kind of the Agile 101 theory. So finally, if I was the monarch for a day, if I was in charge and everything, I have to offer a couple of solutions going away because you have the opportunity and you always want to make things better. I would shift more security processes to the left. I'd have more scans in the CI/CD pipeline. I'd be able to integrate the software. I'd be able to talk about the risk. And I'd introduce people as they started into this risk operations and agile compliance. As our devs started, they'd all come in and talk to security, not as a compliance check, but so we'd get to know them. So we'd understand them, where they are, what they're working, what they're doing, and what their individual goals are as they move into the new teams. So not just the teams, but the individual people, because it's those individuals that make the difference to the overall team through those relationships that you're trying to generate in an agile. And then comparatively, I'd move more security checks to the right. And I say to the right, but not all the way to the right, just a little bit to the right. As the devs complete their stories, as they move forward and they do their features and they do development, I'd have them get to the mindset, to get to the cultural mindset where they think about compliance as one of their acceptance criteria. They have to move it through the government, so it has to be compliant. So they need to think about it early. But that means they need to be just as familiar with what the compliance standards they're looking for as I do. And that talks me talking to them and working with them and working them through how they bring up these definitions of done. President Reagan used to say, in the old Cold War days, he used to say, trust but verify. And it's a lot of that. We trust everyone, but we need to verify that the compliance is there. And it's not us doing the verification. It's the government doing the verification because the government needs to know we're compliant. And they've established a standard that says, here's what you'll be compliant with for everyone. And since that's a standard for value for the product, that's what we'll use. And then finally, we talk about integrating processes. I like to say no meeting is ever boring. One of my pet peeves is people come in and say, hey, this meeting is boring. I don't get it. I don't like it. I'm not going in. It's just boring. But no meeting is boring because no one's issues are unnecessary, especially from risk and compliance. You have to know what the threats are, and you have to know what the vulnerability and the exposure are. And you don't get those without going to the meetings. Everybody has something that they need to bring. And whether that directly applies on your situation or not, it's up to you to kind of make that connection, to come in with an agenda, to come in with a set of things you want to talk about, and be able to create value out of the meeting. If it doesn't create value, there's no sense in having that meeting. But a lot of meetings do, and it's up to us to really make those changes in that process. And that's what we did as security integrating with the devs. We made the changes, we made the integration. And then finally, we want to manage risk on threat and exposure, not just vulnerability. We don't just want to talk about the factors of vulnerability. We want to reduce our threat through reducing our exposure. The threats are going to be out there, but we can reduce how well we see them. We can build the firewalls, we can build the VPNs, we can build the password complexity, we can build the other solutions, we can put the encryption into place so that we reduce those things along the way. So those are my thoughts overall if I was in charge for the day. I told you some of the other organizational takeaways. And I hope you enjoyed it and learned something. Thanks again for the opportunity to GitLab. I had a really good time. This is my briefing on Agile compliance and risk operations, and I'm Dr. Mark.